Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cambridge University Press sponsored webinar, using 3D printing to bring alive classical art and architecture. Jenny and I are so delighted to have Sammy Smith return as our guest presenter this evening for the very last webinar of this school year. Sammy is a very experienced CLC user, and she always has excellent ideas and suggestions to share. She has presented at many of our summer workshops. She's done numerous webinars for us, and she teaches at the Master School in Dobbs Ferry, New York. We are recording this webinar, and the link will be posted in a few days on the NACCP website at cambridgelatin.org and also on the Latin Teaching Support page on YouTube at Cambridge University Press. And if you need a professional development certificate for this evening's webinar, just please email Jenny and me at clctraining@cambridge.org, and we will get you a certificate as soon as possible. And Sammy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So we're going to get started on why 3D printing, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory about why I got interested in it. It feels like a lifetime ago now, but the summer before the pandemic, I got a scholarship to study at the Globe Theatre. And when I was not working at the Globe Theatre with actors and directors and doing a lot of playing, I would spend my time haunting all of the area museums. And of course I had to go to Aqua Sulis, but I did that on a weekend trip when I had a little time off. When I went to the British Museum, one of the things that struck me was how many different 3D representations there were available for people. And there was always an invitation to touch. And I thought, this is exactly the opposite of my experience at most museums, where if you get too close, there is an alarm that goes off or someone tells you to step back, and you never really get an intimate opportunity, even if you're standing in front of a piece of artwork. So they had these wonderful pieces for people who are visually impaired, for children, or for people like me who love to get their hands on things. And they were all over the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum, the London Museum. And then when I went to Aqua Sulis, there were a host of things to look at in Bath. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those and how you can make your own representation, who just happens to look just like the bronze in on the Unit 3 book of Cambridge. Okay, why? Why should we do all of this? The first thing is you get to touch things, you get to handle them, you get to explore them in a way that you might never get to anywhere else. It's not the object, but it gives you a simulation of the object. And I think that's particularly important. So when I look at Sulis Minerva, her head looks like this in the back. It's like that when you go to Aqua Sulis, when you go to Bath, but to have the occasion to slide your hand in and see what it's like is really different. You can also see things. So here's an example of Mars and Venus, and you can see incredible detail, and you can touch it. And this is what I want my students to be able to do too. I want them to be able to make their own pieces, to touch them, to look at the intricacies available. You can print things out in a number of sizes, in a number of shapes, in a number of colors. So my first go around, for example, with Minerva is about 5 inches tall. Then I decided, let's make her nice and big. So you have tiny Minerva and big Minerva. And our 3D printer that I have been using for my spouse's school has been running almost constantly on our table. And we broke her up into pieces. And if you look very carefully, you might be able to see the seams where we've glued her together. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So she's actually in a few different parts.
Excuse me, Sammy, it says that they can't see your screen.
Oh.
Let me see if I have to do something. No, it says you can share. Do you want to stop sharing for a second and try again?
Sure.
And Stephen, can you pop in and tell us if you can see it this time? Go try again, Sammy.
Okay.
Evan can
Yeah,
see. Okay, so,
I cannot see any. I don't see the speaker right now.
all right, so how many people, can you raise your hand if you can see? Because I think we might have, it might be,
Maybe a me thing. I don't know.
yeah, it might, I hate to tell you this, I think it might be you.
Oh.
Donna, you can see?
Okay, and Evan can see, everybody else, nobody else seems to be having a problem.
All right. Well, mea culpa. All right, well, I'll fiddle around at my
Yeah, I'm sorry. It would be easier if we could fix it for you, but
end. Mm-hmm.
So sorry about that. Okay, so we're just talking about Minerva and how you can break her up into pieces. You can break a number of your pieces up into different sections. And I'm going to walk you through all this. So don't panic if you're like, what the heck is going on here? I'm just giving you an overview first. Okay, a couple of other reasons why you might want to do this. It's an opportunity to research, to look deeply into art or architecture or Roman coins. I have only been focusing myself on sculptures. I intend to do more work on coins and architecture, but at this point, all I have surrounding me at this table are, I have Sappho and I have the Sacrapheles. I have wonderful piece again from Bath. So the Gorgon. I've got all sorts of pieces like that. It gives you an opportunity to look into those pieces, to look into their histories, to think about conservation. And it teaches not only students, but it teaches me what I need to be doing to connect to technology. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Open source models, I think, are particularly important right now. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking to you about My Mini Factory. And My Mini Factory is nice because it gives you an opportunity to look at, here's a piece that you can scan. It's all free. It gives you lots of information. You can see the original here as well. And if you want to have your students, or you can create a QR code and place them at the bottom of your sculptures so that you can reference this material after you decide to create something more broad, your own kind of art gallery.
Sammy, Donna will ask, have you done anything in color?
So I'm going to get to that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and that's actually a really loaded question, and I'm glad you brought it up. What I have I had white filament, and the white filament is just what I'd been using, but I have like blue cats. I have things that are, you can get whatever color filament, and filament is the fancy word for the plastic thread that goes through a 3D printer, and I'll show you what that looks like soon. But you can get whatever color you want. You can use multiple colors. But to me, one of the reasons that I like using the white is that you can paint it. And we're going to talk about why that's important as well. So looking at art and architecture through new eyes. This is my bowl of Daphne and Apollo, Bernini's Daphne and Apollo. It is, I think, the hardest piece to remove scaffolding from, and I'm going to show you what scaffolding is. The amount of work that Bernini put into creating pieces that have all of these delicate little leaves that you do not want to break off when you are excavating it from the scaffolding. It's incredibly scary because you think, oh gosh, this is crazy. But I'm going to show you how to dive in with abandon, and then where you want to have a little nuance with your pieces. So you really think about what went on in Bernini's head as he was going through all of this, what an architect might be thinking in a way that you never would if you were just looking at the sculpture. When you are digging through the sculpture, you become an archaeologist, a conservator, an artist yourself. You are taking that different stance. Okay, interdisciplinary connections. Let's say you are completely frightened of any of this stuff and you don't know what to do, that's what your STEAM teachers are for, your librarians, anyone in a local community who happens to have access to a makerspace. And they're more than willing to help you, excited to help you, and want to sell opportunities to use their machines. And lots of independent schools that have the resources not only have one machine, but they'll have multiple machines so that they can do many projects at the same time. Don't worry if you don't know how to do this, because it's an opportunity for you to learn from your colleagues and an opportunity for you to learn from your peers and your students. Okay, we're going to talk about repatriation, decolonization, representations, and looting, and why this is particularly important, and how this can be an opportunity for you to chat with your students. So a lot of museums have decided maybe we shouldn't be keeping all of the artwork that doesn't necessarily belong to us, but we would like to continue to show people in our museum that we once had this, what it looked like and what it's like. And in so many ways, when you return pieces, you not only gain better communication with the communities that you've taken the pieces from. Just think about the formerly known Elgin marbles, which the British Museum no longer calls Elgin marbles, but the Parthenon marbles. If they gave them back, what that would do for relationship between the British Museum and the Parthenon Museum. So that, again, an ongoing debate. It also, I think, particularly helps students think about issues of looting, why you can make your own little pieces and they can be just as interesting and as valuable, and you are not contributing to black market affairs with coins or with little pieces that happen to have been dug up and then sold. So this is a really fantastic article, and I would highly recommend, even though it may not necessarily mention everything to do with ancient Rome, there is some wonderful bit of information down toward the bottom. It's short and it provides lovely discussion, whether you're teaching a classical studies class, whether you're teaching middle school, whether you're teaching upper school, and you want to delve deeply into it. This particular paragraph I find interesting, and we're going to spend a little bit more time diving in. Copying artifacts has a surprisingly long history. So 3D printing is just an extension of everything that the ancient Romans were doing when they were copying Greek statues. So you can talk to your students about how they are doing the same kinds of work that the Romans were doing, but with a different format, with different materials. My students were particularly excited to find out that they were also very much a part and parcel of all of these things. Any questions so far? Okay. What are the drawbacks? So if you want to make a really fancy schmancy piece, it's going to take you a long time. Most of my pieces take between 8 and 16 hours. So it's not fast. And if you have anywhere between 15 and 30 students and you have one 3D printer, you're going to have to think very carefully about what pieces you do and don't want to do. Some pieces are pretty fast, and fast would be like a 2 or 4 hour print. So this is, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to pull off the scaffolding in a bit. This is a Roman eagle, and this took about 4 hours to print, and I left the scaffolding on because I'm going to pull it off so that you can see what that looks like. How do you address issues of equity in the classroom? Maybe you teach at a public school. Maybe you live at home and you are doing homeschooling. Maybe you don't have $700 to buy your own 3D printer. I don't. So those are things that you should be considering and thinking about what public institutions you can reach out to, and there are lots of opportunities for partnership. The last piece is what gets lost in translation. So let's take a look at Slot's piece here. This is the original, and this is the 3D print. And if you look at the original, there's such incredible detail. Like, take a look at the finely tuned feathers on his wings, the sharp delineation here along his torso, and you lose a lot of that in the 3D printing. But again, it's its own piece of art, and you can talk to students and your colleagues about why the Lost in Translation also offers opportunities for exploration. All right, I'm going to walk you through how to print a 3D sculpture, and then I'm going to do a little time-lapse piece of it. So let me pull this up. How to make a 3D sculpture. First, find an STL file to print. Sites such as myminifactory.com and some museum sites have scans of sculptures in stereolithography, STL format. The STL file encodes a three-dimensional representation of the shape of the surface of the sculpture. Next, you need to prepare the STL file for printing with your specific 3D printer. 3D printing requires translating the STL file into a series of commands for the 3D printer using a slicing program. For the Prusa 3D printer I'm demonstrating, the slicer program is called Prusa Slicer. Use the menus to import the STL file. You'll see the sculpture and be able to rotate it in 3 dimensions on the screen. If you simply use all the default settings, you'll probably get an acceptable print. If you learn to modify a few settings, you'll be able to improve the detail of the print while reducing the printing time. Note, most of the 5-inch tall sculptures I printed took between 8 and 16 hours to print. Under print settings, you choose how thick each print layer should be. Thinner layers mean more detail, thicker layers mean faster printing. I'm going to choose 1/5 of a millimeter thick layer. Some slicer programs like this one allow you to set thinner layers where you want more detail and thicker layers where the detail isn't as critical. Under filament, choose settings that match the kind of plastic filament you're using. The most common filament used today, polylactic acid or PLA, is non-toxic, odorless, and prints reliably. A 1 kilogram roll of filament costs about $25 and can print at least 8 sculptures of the size I'm showing. Under printer, select the model of printer you are using. I'm using a Prusa MK3. Under supports, select everywhere. The printer builds a sculpture from the base up 1 layer at a time. The printer can't print plastic in midair. There must be support scaffolds underneath it. These sculptures tend to need a lot of scaffolding, and finding ways to reduce the scaffolding by cutting the sculpture in half and printing it in 2 parts, for example, can reduce print time and plastic waste. Under infill, choose a fairly low percentage, such as 15%. A small amount of infill gives the sculpture plenty of strength, where a solid infill would unnecessarily use a lot of plastic. Under size, you can make the print whatever size you want. Bigger uses more filament and takes longer to print. Once you have the print settings ready, click Slice Now. The computer works out the tool path for where the extruder will move during every layer of the print. It will also tell you how long the print will take and how many grams of plastic filament will be used. If you like, you can modify the settings and reslice to reduce the print time or the amount of scaffolding needed. You may also notice some mostly horizontal places that look a bit rough and would benefit from thinner print layers in those areas. You can also scroll through what each layer of the print will look like using the sliders next to the 3D model. Once you're happy with the sliced model, click Export G-code, which are all of the toolpath instructions for completing the print. For the Prusa printer, the G-code is saved on an SD card and inserted into the printer. Other printers require the computer to be attached to the printer, and other printers can be connected to a network so that they work just like any other paper printer. So as you are looking at that piece, and I'm just going to go back and hit pause for a moment, you will see that, let me just a sec.
Hey, look, it's your heater and air conditioner.
It's unhappy with me. So one of the things that you want to pay attention to is scaffolding. And I've mentioned this before. And as you go through this next time-lapse piece, you will see how the extruder pushes the filament out. There's a lot of information that I did, so please feel free to go back, pause, watch, and this is only one particular way to do it through the Prusa Slicer program. So there are other places that, other ways that you can do all of this. Jenny, did you have a question? No, okay. So this is a time-lapse piece. So that's the piece that I just did, and I'm going to undo the scaffolding now. So let me close this out. Okay, so did anyone recognize where that music was from?
It sounds familiar, but no.
It's from the Channing Tatum, Jamie Bell movie, The Eagle.
Oh, okay. And that's what this is, yep.
Eagle. Right. So I'm just going to pin my video so that you can watch me dig into this. And it's not scary at all. If I can do it, anyone can do it. So I've got some heavy duty tweezers, I've got needle nose pliers, and I've got this really nice pointer file that can help you dig in. And again, like middle schoolers can do this, and it's totally safe. And it's actually really fun. Sometimes I come home and if I've had a stressful day, I'm like, I need something to rip the scaffolding out of, and it's a real stress relief. Okay, so it doesn't sound great when I'm doing it, but I'm just going to slide my tweezers in, and I'm going to break off pieces like this, maybe a little bit like going to the dentist, but a lot more fun than going to the dentist. And I'm just pulling this all off so you can see. And again, like I'm going to be pretty forceful with it, right? So
I can see why this is fun. I would totally love clicking all these pieces off. I know me. Yeah.
it's so delightful. See, already I've got, and they come out in really nice big chunks sometimes. That's incredibly satisfying. Sometimes you have more difficult pieces, so you might want to switch your tool. So maybe I'll take the needle nose pliers and I'm going to grab and yank.
Tammy, you can't destroy what's actually been molded though. Like you'd have to like why can't you break off part of the eagle by accident?
That's a great question. So it depends on what kind of sculpture you have. So this eagle is such a nice piece to work with because this plastic is really hardy and the scaffolding is nice and flexible. So you can kind of pull it out without hurting any of the wings. That said, the more complicated the statue, for example,
my
the Rape of
gosh.
Sabine women, the harder it is. This was awful to do, but also incredibly satisfying. Here's Laocoon.
Oh my gosh.
Right, and so you might consider, when you have pieces like this, doing it in parts. And if you do it in parts, you have less scaffolding. This is not done in parts. And so you have all these tiny pieces that you're trying to get, and you have to make sure that you don't break off. I've broken off a lot of fingers. Fingers are hard. Why is this important? Because when your students are doing things like this, it's very much like what any archaeologist, any conservator faces, right? Like, watch the nose, watch the fingers, watch other things that we know have a tendency to fall off in sculptures. Yeah, so I've got, this was really challenging, the Laocoon, the Rape of the Sabine women.
Can I make one other observation? You know, everybody always jokes about what's missing on statues when we find them, noses, arms, other things, right? And this actually kind of makes the point that why they're so, you know, why sometimes things are missing. You know, they're easily broken off, you know.
And it's not irreparable. That's the nice thing about plastic too. So when I was doing this piece, all of this stuff was scaffolding, and I was like, oh, this is going to break. And it did. And then you just print a nice long spear and you glue it in. And that's what they would do in a museum too. Not necessarily with plastic, but with other kinds of material. It works splendidly, and it's incredibly satisfying. And you really get to the idea of, okay, I can handle this. I'm just going to show you one little last piece. So this is a really helpful tool. And if I can't get into something, you just kind of dig in to loosen the piece, and then you can pull out whatever it was that was so hard to get out before. And once you get one piece, everything else comes out in nice form. So I'm going to clean up my eagle. And if you have files to use, and I'm going to walk you through what you need file-wise, but it's really, really quite splendid once you get everything through. Okay, how are we doing? Did anyone, were you clinching, listening to me going through the scaffolding? I did it for my mother, and my mother was like, ugh, stop.
No, you seem so confident, but as long as you were doing it and we weren't, I'm sure we felt good.
The first time you do it, I think you feel very, very nervous about it, but do like 10 of these and you're just going to be like, whatever, I'm moving through. And there are some places, as you start designing your own pieces, you know very carefully, this is a piece that I need to be very careful with, and I can't dive in with abandon. And then the others, it's like, look how solid this head is. You can, anything here, just pull out super fast, super easy. Here's an example of the kind of scaffolding on a caryatid in front of the Erechtheion. So you might want to be careful around her braids up at the front, but like pretty much anything in front of her face is fine. And you can see her whole head is covered in scaffolding. So same piece, one covered in scaffolding, fresh off the press, and one that I have pulled all of the scaffolding off of.
Wow.
We can
And
do
the
more.
scaffolding is part of the program that it's when you pick that particular or design a particular thing, it's going to have that to, because it's part of the same plastic, right? It's just
Precisely. It's all made from the same filament, and filament is that fancy word for the plastic thread. And you can use whatever kind of filament. PLA is typically what people use. And it's cheap. I mean, you can make tons of these little sculptures and pass them around your classroom after everybody's hand sanitized and socially distanced and whatever. But at some point, we won't be as concerned about those kinds of things. And we really do want students to touch. And that was the thing to me that I kept thinking, like, my students need an opportunity to touch things, to see things up close, because it's not going to be like this forever. And everything starts from the bottom. So there's typically like some kind of foundation here. Like sometimes it's nice and smooth, but sometimes the foundations can be a little rougher. I'm looking for an example of a rougher bottom. Yeah, so here's an example where you might see a little rough edge.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you can't print an arm up here without having some kind of scaffolding to support it. So you've got to print plastic all the way up
Right,
in
okay.
order for this to go up. Does that make sense?
Because it prints from the bottom up, is that how it works?
It prints from the bottom up.
Right.
And
That makes sense, yeah.
here's so this is the 3D printer. Here, this is the one that I have sitting on our table. The heating bed slides back and forth. So it gets nice and hot. You clean it with a little alcohol. And also sometimes you wipe a little glue stick on it and then you wipe the glue stick off, and you don't have to do that too often. People have all sorts of wonderful, wonderful recommendations. And the STEAM person who's in charge of your 3D printer will give you all of those wonderful tips and hacks and things to make things go really easily. And it pops right off as soon as it's done. So that bed moves back and forth and the extruder moves back and forth, and it's nice and easy. I'm going to show you, this is a link to the Met Museum's 3D scanning, hacking, and printing in art museums for the masses. Take advantage of whatever museums or maker spaces have available for you. So let me just click on this so that you can see. Again, another resource for you as a teacher, so that you can see, here's why we're using 3D printing. It's not just for like fun little thing that you want to do in the classroom. People all over the world are using it and using it for a wide array of things. And so it's just their firsthand experience of how to use 3D printing, how to scan an image. Joe Davenport has that wonderful Caecilius. I would love to get a scan of Caecilius so I can make my own Caecilius bust. It won't look as cool as his, but it will be a lot cheaper. So someday I'm
How do
going
we make that happen? Do we have to get him to bring it to New York so you can scan it, or how do you do this?
yes, yeah. And there are
We'll make
also
that happen somewhere.
wonderful, yeah, they're wonderful scanning programs. So, and you can, the better the scan of a piece, the more you can spend time alternating the depth. So you get like wonderful folds and garments. So this is Sappho. You get her lyre down here. Here's the Sacrapheles. And when I mentioned in that video earlier, there are some places like wherever there's a shoulder often or the top of a head, you might want more definition. So this gives you an idea about like we really increased the definition here because it's flat. So there's a little bit of that. Definitely like just look through museum spaces. You can type in museum 3D printing and there's so much stuff out. It's super, super helpful. So many resources. Okay. Am I going too quickly?
No, it's great.
Okay. All right. Where do I go to find all of these things? My go-to is mymanufactory.com. It is the hosting site for Scan the World. It's free. Almost any museum site that, and again, these are largely Western, so we are dealing with that, but we're also dealing with ancient Rome, and that's Western. So a lot of these Western museums have opportunities for you to download scans that their curators have done. That's the British Museum, the Met, Victoria and Albert. They'll also sell you things. They're all too happy to sell you things, but if you can download it and make your own and then share them with your students, great. I have not spent a lot of time on Tinkercad, but if you want to chat with another science teacher, some engineering teacher, a STEAM teacher who would help you and your students create and edit your own 3D models. Like I would like to create a liger, my lion tiger version. I want to create something from Ovid's Metamorphoses, some animal. You could have your kids design that. I'm still in my infancy with this. Again, like I've just got into sculptures and I've just done the My Mini Factory. And then Thingiverse is also really fun, and that's for architecture. And I'm headed to looking at architectural pieces and coins next. Free, 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 free. It couldn't get any better. And I think one of the benefits to this is open source. It's not just great for us, but it also shares, like, oh yeah, let's say something caught on fire, or some server went down and lost a great deal of information. You are a person who holds a scan of something maybe important for someone, that you can carry on the legacy of a particular work of art. Okay, what you need. You need a 3D printer. That's a basic expectation. You need software. The software is generally free with the printer. And then again, I'm just going to go over the tools. So you need some kind of heavy duty tweezers. These are medical tweezers. So anything that's really nice and thick. You need needle nose pliers of some kind, something that's going to get into the crevices of your sculptures. And you need some kind of file tool. That's really about it. All right, Donna, we're going to get to your question. You were asking about color, and these pieces are going to talk to you in more depth. We're going to let Carrie Vout walk us through first, and then we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, Carrie Vout, hit it.
The Peplos Kore. Behind me, you're looking at a plaster cast of an ancient Greek statue dating from around 530 BC and found late in the 19th century on the Acropolis in Athens, where she was originally displayed. Now, up until the 19th century, Greece had been under Ottoman occupation, which meant that the Greek and Roman statues that were best known to people were those that had been found in Italian soil and were largely in Italian collections. People didn't know that Greek sculpture could look like this. Greek sculpture was classical sculpture, it was naturalistic sculpture. This doesn't look like that. It's frontal, it's stiff, it's very much still of the block. But arguably, that's her power, as is the stylization in her hair, and in her frock, and in her makeup, and in her jewelry. Statues' male equivalents at this time were nude, largely, and their power was very much in their physiques, whereas her power is in her dress. It's in her adornment. It's in this kind of look at me modesty. It's also, of course, in her pigment. Up until the late 18th century, and indeed sometimes beyond that, whenever a statue was found in the ground, it was immediately whisked off to the restorer's studio and it was scrubbed of all of its color to make it shiny white. In some senses, it was a fashion for plaster casts, a fashion that had been live since the 16th century, that kind of fueled this aesthetic for whiteness. Whiteness, of course, then bringing with it a politics of purity that we now associate with the classical antique, something that is kind of difficult and, of course, dangerous. It is modernity that has created this sense of a whitewashed Greece. In fact, had we gone back there into the 5th century BC, we would find that the Greeks lived in glorious technicolor. Now, our cast of the Peplos Kore was painted up because the original has, as it was found in the late 19th century, pigment still very much on it. And so in the 1970s, one of my predecessors here at Cambridge, Robert Cook, actually painted up this cast to give us all a stronger sense of what these sculptures originally looked like. Now, of course, like every act of restoration, it is an act of imagination. So I can't tell you for definite that her dress was painted like this. And in fact, there are alternative reconstructions out there, but it gives you a stronger sense of her original feel. As well as her color, The other restoration that you're looking at here is her arm. If you were to see the statue in the New Acropolis Museum in Athens, she is missing that bit. What we don't know is who it is we're looking at, whether we're looking at a worshipper to the god who is coming, bringing a cult offering, and in a sense offering herself up at the same time to the viewer, or whether actually she should rather have been holding, say, a bow or something like that, in which case you'd be looking at the statue of the god herself. What I can say is that were she put back onto the Acropolis in the 6th century BC, together with all sorts of other statues like her but not like her, in similarly beautiful frocks but different frocks, in different materials, different scales and sizes, then it is the crowd of those statues together that would have created a sense of wonder.
So this is a piece that I use with my students to get them to unpack their own misconceptions about what statue should look like. Should a statue look like this? Would the Greeks have had it look like this? No. So we're going to do one more little piece. And I think these are really, really important. I think this is the most important kind of work that we can do when we're talking about art, architecture, history, and culture, and how we unpack all of those things. So let me get to this piece as well.
Whoa, Susan.
Oh, I'm looking for coupon codes.
Well, Capital One Shopping instantly searches
I'm
for
sorry
available
about
coupon
this.
codes and automatically applies them.
Save me some
Whenever I
cheddar.
do
Capital
the,
One Shopping. It's kind of genius.
whenever I
What's
do
in
the
your
shortcut to get rid of the ads, it doesn't always embed
This
well in a
is Caesar
presentation.
Augustus. He was the first official emperor of the Roman Empire. And if you've ever had to study Roman history, you might be familiar with this little sculpture's very famous original. It's called the Augustus of Prima Porta. It was carved in the 1st century AD during his reign as emperor. Then it was lost to time before it was dug up again in the 1860s. Today, it lives in the Vatican museums alongside a bunch of other famous sculptures. But Augustus, he's not supposed to look like this. He's supposed to look like this. Let's get this out of the way. Ancient Greece and Rome were really colorful. Their buildings were full of intricate frescoes and elaborate mosaics, and covered with vibrantly painted statues of things like epic battles, glimmering gods, and pretty flowers. But today, most of us picture something more like this: brilliant white marble as far as the eye can see. We're wrong, but it's not our fault. It's Hollywood's fault, and our high school textbook's fault. But most of all, it's this guy's fault. Well, not him. He's just a statue. The blame lies with Michelangelo, the guy who sculpted him, and with many others who made white marble statues during the Renaissance, when European artists, philosophers, and scientists developed a renewed interest in the creations of classical Greece and Rome. Artists like Michelangelo began studying Roman sculptures, like this one, Laocoon and his sons. They fell in love with its lifelike figures, dramatic scene, and pristine white surface. But sculptures like this weren't meant to be white. Their paint had just faded after being buried or left out in the open air for hundreds of years. So when the Renaissance artists set out to imitate them, they left their masterpieces bare too. And that style took over, inspiring generations of sculptors. White marble became the norm. Along the way, art historians reinforced this bias, namely this guy, Johann Joachim Winckelmann. He's sometimes known as the father of art history. In the 18th century, he wrote a hugely influential book on ancient art. In it, he argued that statues like this one, the Apollo of Belvedere, are the epitome of beauty, because the whiter the body is, the more beautiful it is. He went out of his way to ignore obvious evidence of colored marble, and there was a lot of it, especially after the rediscovery of the ancient Roman city of Pompeii in the 1700s. Pompeii's near perfectly preserved frescoes featured all sorts of colored statues, and one particular mural of an artist in the act of painting a sculpture. This colorful sculpture was also found in Pompeii. Winckelmann claimed it was too primitive to have been made by them. But evidence wasn't just ignored. Some of it might have been destroyed. Remember Augustus? When archaeologists rediscovered him in the 1860s, they said his tunic was crimson, his armor was yellow, and his mantle, that's this thing, was purple. And this is him now. It's unclear if Augustus lost his color by accident as a result of overcleaning, or if it was removed on purpose. But either way, the same thing happened to a bunch of other famous monuments and sculptures, like the Parthenon in Athens, which once looked something like this. By the 18th century, it had faded to something more like this, with just hints of color left. But today, even those are gone. Luckily, art historians have since shifted to believe it's not about what people think looks better, it's about what's accurate. But how do they get from this to this? To start, there are some surviving ancient descriptions of more famous sculptures, which is how we know that the Parthenon once held a statue of the goddess Athena that was ivory and gold, wearing a helmet adorned with the likeness of a sphinx. And if you look closely at some sculptures, there are still obvious traces of color, like the remnants of deep purple on this statue's clothing. That's how early reconstructions like these were made. Today, scientists can extract and test those tiny samples to determine the original pigments used. But when there aren't any visible colors, they have another tool: ultraviolet light. Certain pigments glow under UV light, exposing traces that would have been otherwise invisible. When scientists photographed this archer's legs under UV light, they saw this: a dizzying array of geometric patterns and saturated colors. And when they compared it to trace pigments on a similar statue, they were able to make this reconstruction, which, to be clear, is about as ancient as mine. Because conservationists never add color to the original. They use 3D scanners to create plaster replicas, which they then painstakingly repaint with far greater accuracy than I can. Seeing these sculptures in full color might be a little shocking at first, but that's probably because we've only seen them one way for centuries. To the Greeks and the Romans, painting a sculpture made it complete. Color can make marble seem human or godlike. It infused them with drama and emotion. It brought history and mythology to life. And even though these reconstructions aren't perfect, seeing these statues in color can bring us a little closer to understanding what the ancient world might have looked like.
Wow.
So these are particularly powerful pieces that you can use in your classroom, not only to start discussions, but to continue discussions about representations. If you think about the Padilla-Peralta piece in the New York Times about how he was talking about saving classics from whiteness, about how a lot of the appropriation of classics by the rioters during Capitol Hill on January 6th. I think all of these things are things that we owe to our students, to ourselves, to our colleagues, to our discipline, to reconsider what's going on and why Sappho should not remain white, and how kids would repaint her and what she would look like. If you want to start off with the videos, I think it's a great and an incredibly accessible place. The New Yorker has an article called The Myth of Whiteness in Classical Sculpture. Forbes has an article called Whitewashing Ancient Statues. So if you're looking for other textual evidence in kind of written form, those pieces I think are really, really helpful as opportunities to refer to each of those pieces. And they mention similar crossovers and things that have done. I would say, hie thee to an art museum, virtual or otherwise. Ask a curator to talk to you about what pieces look like when they're really studied, and what recommendations they would have with regard to paint. Or let the kids use their own imagination. Use your own imagination in your pieces as you're recreating them. Okay, ideas in 3D. So there's this ancient Roman gold. There are a ton of really fun pieces. 12 Yale students rebuild ancient Roman gold. It's really out of control. And they do this all through 3D printing.
Wow.
Yeah, I can't even imagine doing something like this. And this was years and years and years ago. So I'm gonna mosey on because I don't want to spend too much time on these. All right, here's the last little bit that I want to talk about. How do you bring this back into your classroom? ACTFL's 5 C's. So communication, what does this look like? Let's say you bring in, and this is a piece that I did in a couple of pieces. So you've got your she-wolf, and then you've got your 2 Romulus and Remus babies underneath. It's 2 separate pieces. I want to start off, maybe I'm teaching Livy, and I want to have students unpack what's going on in the story. How would you present this she-wolf? How would you characterize the stories? You can do this at any level. You can have students rewrite the narrative. What do you think's going on here? Would you take Livy's version of Romulus and Remus, or would you take Ovid's version of Romulus and Remus and how the brothers interact with one another later? Use the sculpture as a jumping off point to talk about what the author was doing, what the artist was doing, and what the student, their perception of the story. And it can go in any one of these components. So if you just go back and think about understanding, interpreting, analyzing, negotiating meaning, how you present those kinds of things, you've got a wealth of information. That's just the first of the 5 C's. Cultures, so learners use Latin or Greek to investigate, explain, reflect. You can do any sort of Socratic seminar with students. You can use debates. You can bring in Carrie Vout. You can bring in the articles from the New Yorker and really dig deeply into what's going on here. How would the Greeks and Romans have presented these pieces? How are we presenting them? What's the problem with all of those? Opportunities for connection. This is one of the most wonderful interdisciplinary pieces that is so easy to reach out to people within your buildings or just outside of your buildings who would love to collaborate with you. Talk to architecture firms and ask them if they would be interested in helping. They often are more than willing to work with kids and are so excited about selling their profession to young people who would be interested in continuing and growing. And all of the things that you do in your class, students can carry with them later. So it's not only ACTFL's 5 C's, but it's this kind of larger notion of beauty and appreciation and play in the classroom. Comparisons. So you can have students, if they get to some kind of level with Tinkercad where they're designing their own pieces, or you can have small pieces, large pieces, different colored pieces, how they paint different things and present them side by side. Bring people in for a touchable art gallery in this virtual world. You can bring people in for an art gallery where students themselves have gotten the opportunity to handle, but you see a side-by-side opportunity for students to take things in a different realm. So that's where we leave it at the moment. What questions do you have? What things have I? Yes, I'd be happy to share the presentation, Jenny. Let me do that now.
Because, you know, people are texting me saying, are we going to get it? And of course, I figured we were.
Yes.
What has been the biggest reaction your students have had to this experience?
Often, the first time we talk about how statues aren't white, it's incredibly surprising. And it was surprising for me to think about things in a different way, that this isn't how the museums have portrayed them isn't necessarily how we should be thinking about Greek and Roman statues, that we've been inculcated into this kind of notion of whiteness. So yeah, Donna, you were saying the color of the filament. I used white because I think it's easy to paint on, also because there are a number of kinds of marble that are white, but you can use black. I'd really like to get some black filament and do my own cats that way, so it matches exactly what's on the book. I could paint it too. Students have a lot of fun. I mean, reach out to your art teachers and ask them about what they think would be really useful kinds of paints to use on PLA. That's the kind of plastic filament that you can use. It's really, really helpful.
I could see where I would think for students after a while, having the ability to look at something differently and having you coach them through this process of looking at a piece of art and holding it in its hands and seeing what breaks and all those other things would make them much more articulate about what's happening with sculpture and art of any kind. I mean, really, I think it's a gift you're giving them by doing this. And as you said, the connections that, they can make with the world.
Yeah, I think they become much more sensitive consumers and producers of art themselves. I mean, the bottom line is these aren't the original works, right? This is not the Minerva, but it is a Minerva, and it is a Minerva that I have created and that my students can choose to create. They get real ownership over, like, I did that, that's mine. Kids love it when you, like, I would give out my little, so these little things, when students do really well, I play this Conquer the Empire game. And once they have conquered a certain number of countries or they've built a number of bridges, they get an eagle, and they're vying for the eagle. It's like, I need the eagle, I need the aquila. Necesitas mi habere aquilam. So it's like, okay, of course you do. Of course you need the eagle. We all do. So I keep thinking, like, this is one of my first pieces. It's really rudimentary, doesn't have a lot of detail. But I mean, look back here, like, who's going to look back there? Typically, like, this is what you see, and you don't even realize that maybe Daedalus put some wings on the back of his son's feet
Right,
before.
there's rudders.
Exactly.
Like a surfboard's rudder. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and again, like, you can just like go to town with the scaffolding on this. It's not breakable. It's so easy. No fingers are lost in the unscaffolding.
That's a good first one. But like I taught in a district that had a whole lot of surfers because we were by the ocean, and I could see them talking about that or getting why that makes sense. Or it probably brings out some kids who aren't necessarily your word nerds, but might look at this and be like, oh, I get this.
To me, there's so many things that you can do. You can bury these if you have access to, you can bring in a box of dirt and give each kid a box of dirt, and then they have to pull these statues out of the dirt and think about what they would do in order to clean them off. You could put them in the dirt with the scaffolding, which would be even more wonderful. They're trying to pull all of those pieces of scaffolding off. So that's one level. I think too, like, if you're really interested in doing more oral Latin, you can do all sorts of things. You can talk about, you can use body parts like, you can say, oculus, oculi, you can use her, you can have the kids do it. When I do Flipgrid, it's so much easier for them to have something like, when I teach demonstrative pronouns in the context of what the students have been reading, and I ask them to tell me, like, how do you know this nose, those eyes, etc. It's easier for them to have something to show. And it becomes.
You can even do colors if you paint one.
You can do lots.
But I was thinking stage 10 with the story of statuae.
Oh, yes,
You could actually have 3 statues.
I want the girl.
I would think, I remember the first time I showed my students a recreation on a video, that one, one of the ones with the archer, and they just thought he was so garish and they couldn't believe. And I'm looking at them in the way, really, have we ever noticed what we wear sometimes, especially in costumes? So yeah, I think that's very cool. Well, thank you as always so much. You always bring such interesting and creative things to us. And I think you probably have debunked a lot of fear people might have. So now they have to go find their STEAM department or a friend's STEAM department or anybody who has one of these anywhere,